People hated Robert Ford for killing Jesse James. Years after, Ford was in a saloon when a man caught him off guard and tried to avenge James. What happened next was utterly horrifying. Whether you're a fan of the Wild West or not, Jesse James is a name you've probably heard of. His legend grew so big following his passing that it is still written about today. Robert Ford's life and fate are irrevocably tied to that of Jesse James. Yet his name is almost forgotten. Who was Robert Ford, and why was he forever remembered as a dirty little coward? Robert Ford, commonly called Bob by his friends and family, was born in 1861 in Ray County, Missouri. Ford was born only 8 months after the start of the American Civil War. For the first 4 years of his life, this highly volatile and gruesome conflict raged. Ford only knew this version of America, and it affected his goals. Therefore, it would also determine his fate. This famous American conflict also determined the fate of another man. Jesse James also grew up in Missouri, calling Clay County his home. In 1861, as civil conflict began to tear the states apart, Jesse James was only 14 years old. As a border state, Missouri saw particularly savage battle tactics. It would not be long before the bloodshed drew Jesse James in. It would be the start of these stories that would put stars in the eyes of young Robert Ford. Although the conflict ended in 1865, the tensions it created remained throughout the United States. In Missouri, in particular, there was a sharp divide between those who had supported the North and those who had supported the South. In this tension, Jesse James and those he had served with would continue to cause trouble for authorities. Ford grew up on the stories of these famous outlaws. Over time, the stories of Jesse James and his gang of outlaws would continue to grow. They would become known as the famous James Younger Gang, made up of the 2 James brothers and the 4 younger brothers. And Jesse James would become a folk hero. It's not surprising that as a young man, also from Missouri, born in conflict, Robert Ford idolized Jesse James. He wanted to be like him. He wanted the glory. It would take nearly 2 decades, but Robert Ford would eventually get the opportunity to meet his hero. The exact details of how it came to be are lost to time. However, in 1880, at the age of 18, Ford crossed paths with the famous Jesse James, and his dreams came true. James gave Ford and his brother, Charlie, the chance to be bona fide outlaws. They say that you shouldn't meet your heroes. As time went on, this became the case for Robert Ford and Jesse James. Although James allowed the 4 brothers into his gang, history tells a story that is less than favorable to them. Most historians agree that Jesse James welcomed the Ford brothers because he had a lack of manpower. It seemed that anybody was better than nobody, and the Fords at least counted as bodies. A few years earlier, Jesse James had gotten himself into trouble. An attempt to rob the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota in 1876 went disastrously. By the time the dust had settled, only James and his brother Frank remained. All the rest involved had either been caught or were no longer alive. The famed outlaw needed new men. Ford's opportunity was coming around. Both Jesse James and his brother fled from the scene and went underground. When they appeared again, they had taken on aliases. James went by Thomas Howard. While Frank seemed to be more comfortable with the quiet life, James couldn't settle down. He was an outlaw. He needed a mission. He needed a new gang. The Fords were in. Or at least Charlie was. Robert Ford just couldn't catch a break. He may have believed that he could be an outlaw, but Jesse James didn't seem to agree. While sources suggest that Charlie Ford participated in the train heist James organized with his new gang, no records mention Ford's involvement. Historians believe that Ford was little more than a fringe player, a hanger-on, that James didn't trust. Maybe he had good reason. James's new gang didn't have the fortitude that his original gang had. Battle hadn't hardened and bonded them as it had his last gang. They were common criminals looking for fame, wealth, or glory. The gang quickly fell apart, forcing James to make a decision. He moved his family to St. Joseph, Missouri. He claimed to be giving up on his outlaw ways. He also brought the 4 brothers with him, his first mistake. It's hard to say when exactly Ford began to plot against Jesse James. At what point did his idolization of his former hero turn into resentment? Without access to Ford's inner thoughts, we can never say. However, the opportunity to change his fate originated on a perfectly normal morning in January 1882. Among those that Ford had become connected with since joining up with Jesse James were James Liddell and James's cousin Wood Height. That day, Height, Liddell, and Ford were all staying with Ford's sister, the widowed Martha Bolton. James was reportedly fond of Bolton and used her home often to shelter. None gathered that day realized that it would have such a lasting impact on history. What started as an ordinary breakfast quickly turned into pandemonium. Haight and Liddell began to argue. According to some sources, they argued over Bolton, though that detail is not definitive. The topic doesn't matter. What matters is that Liddell and Haight felt so passionately that revolvers were drawn, and it all fell apart from there. Initially, Ford was nothing more than a bystander in this feud. He remained off to the side, watching as the argument escalated. According to one source, Haight was the first to fire, letting loose 4 rounds, one of which hit Liddell in the leg. Liddell returned the favor, hitting Haight in the arm. Everything may have been different if it had only ended there. Although nearly all sources indicate that Ford had nothing to do with this argument, he took out his firearm as the conflict started. Having a stronger connection to Liddell than he did to Haight, Ford took Liddell's side. Ford only fired once, far less compared to the others. However, it was Ford's shot that was true. He hit Haight in the head and sealed his fate. Initially, it seemed that Ford was willing to handle the situation. He supposedly covered the body with a blanket and took it outside. With the help of a mule, Ford reportedly took the body into the woods where he left Haight in a shallow, unmarked grave. Ford had fired just one single shot. However, he had 2 very big problems. First of all, the rule of the land prohibited his actions. The authorities would be after him. Secondly, Haight had been Jesse James' first cousin. James expected loyalty within his gang. Rumors were he had already removed a couple of gang members for disloyalty. What would stop him from doing the same to Ford? In the end, being charged may have been the most favorable of Ford's 2 options. Jesse James may have been able to hide from authorities, but Robert Ford was not Jesse James, no matter how much he may have wanted to be. It was not long until the local authorities came around asking questions about Haight. This should have terrified Ford, who would likely face the noose for his actions. But he had an ace in his pocket, Jesse James. Some sources claim that during this period, Jesse James was considering going straight, aka giving up his life as an outlaw. However, whether it was true or not, the authorities did not care. None wanted to capture Jesse James more than Governor Thomas Crittenden, who had just recently been elected and was determined to curb James's influence in Missouri. Ford was very aware of this fact when authorities took him in. As no records of Ford's state of mind exist, it's hard to say if he went into this bargain looking for revenge, or if he was just attempting to save himself. However, regardless of motivation, Ford did not hesitate to use Jesse James to his advantage. The moment that he was alone with local authorities, he informed them that he could get Jesse James, and they were very interested. Once Ford had mentioned James's name, his wrongdoing was completely forgotten. The authorities dropped any discussion of that incident. Instead, they brought in Crittenden. They agreed that if Ford could deliver James's body, then Crittenden would not only pardon Ford for both murders, but give Ford the reward money, $10,000, equivalent to $300,000 today. Ford didn't hesitate. He even brought his brother, Charlie, in on the plan. Around the same time that all this was happening behind his back, Jesse James started planning for another heist. He had his eyes on the city bank. However, he lacked manpower. His original gang was still locked up or in the afterlife. His second gang had fled and were turning on each other. Whether he liked it or not, he had to trust the Ford brothers or forego the plan altogether. Unfortunately, he trusted the Fords. James had invited the Ford brothers to stay with him and his family. On the morning of April 3rd, 1882, the 3 men were in the middle of planning their heist. They had eaten breakfast and moved into the living room in order to discuss their plans. Some sources claim that they were intending to leave for the city that day, but they never got there. The exact details of what followed vary slightly depending on the source. As often happens when so much time has passed, the most interesting version of events states that James read the newspaper when something caught his eye. A report stated that Liddell had confessed to participating in Haight's passing, something that the Fords should have mentioned, but never did. That's when something interesting happened. Nearly all sources agree upon one thing. Jesse James suspected the Ford brothers of having betrayed him moments before tragedy unraveled. It should have been Robert Ford's worst nightmare. The famed outlaw suspected him of the ultimate betrayal. Yet, James didn't confront the Fords at that moment. Instead, he gave Ford the very opening he needed. Upon discovering Liddell's involvement in the disappearance of Haight, and surely suspecting that the Fords were also involved in something nefarious, Jesse James didn't react. He instead laid his revolver down on the sofa. He then decided to do a bit of light housekeeping. Noticing a dusty picture, he went to clean it, turning his back on the very men he suspected of betraying him. If there had been a time when Ford had conflicted feelings about what he had to do, it was now long gone. The moment that Jesse James turned his back to him, Ford took the opportunity, raising his revolver, and Ford took the shot. Perhaps Jesse James regretted his strange actions in his final moment. Perhaps he wanted to look Ford in the eye as he pulled the trigger. Either way, he turned towards Ford slightly in his last moment. Ford hit James just below the right ear. He never stood a chance. Robert Ford killed Jesse James. Though, if he expected fame, he had another thing coming. Having taken Jesse James's life in cold blood, the Ford brothers fled the house, making a beeline for the local telegraph office. One source claimed that Robert Ford was yelling what he'd just done the whole day. However, when the news reached authorities, the brothers were in for a nasty surprise. They weren't greeted with the reward money. Instead, the authorities charged them. Robert Ford was the one who pulled the trigger. However, they charged both Robert and his brother. Their trial was a whirlwind. Within a day of having committed the act, the authorities indicted them, and they pleaded guilty to the wrongdoing. The tribunal sentenced them to hanging. With no communication from Crittenden at this point, Ford likely felt as if he'd been hung out to dry. Where was his deal? Where was Crittenden? Robert Ford and his brother would be left to sit for another 2 hours before intervention would come his way. Crittenden was good to his word, for the most part. Not long after the authorities gave them their sentences, Crittenden pardoned both the Ford brothers for James as well as Robert for his involvement with Height. It was the money that the Fords wouldn't see. Jesse James had been worth $10,000. Greed was undoubtedly as much a motivator for Robert Ford as saving his hide had been. However, neither Ford nor his brother would see that $10,000. Once Crittenden pardoned them, they received some money. However, it was nowhere near what they had been promised, and they were about to come under fire publicly as well. The answer to what Ford expected to get out of removing Jesse James will remain a mystery forever. While many factors likely went into his decision, one of them was almost definitely fame. After all, if you off the greatest outlaw to ever live, surely that must make you an even greater outlaw. Unfortunately, public opinion did not agree, and if Ford sought fame, he was about to be sorely disappointed. The truth is that Jesse James had good marketing. He wasn't a hero, he was an outlaw in every sense of the word. However, over the years, the media had portrayed him as a Robin Hood figure. To the public, betraying him as Ford did was not heroic, it was cowardly, and they let him know it. Although Ford did not receive the reward money that he thought he would get, he still attempted to capitalize on his actions. He posed for photos, often with his famed revolver, and he traveled with shows, reenacting James's last moments. However, neither of these ventures ended up being very popular. The public reviled Ford, taking any opportunity to heckle him. People would remember Ford, but not how he'd hoped. Robert Ford has been remembered for his connection with Jesse James. However, over the centuries, he's become the villain of the story. The most famous line about Ford comes from a contemporary street ballad, "The dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard." Howard being James's alias at the time of his passing. That song, and James, would haunt Ford for the rest of his life. If there was any saving grace for Ford, it has come from modern historians. One thing that often followed Ford negatively is the fact that he surprised James from behind. It doesn't fit with the image America holds of the honorable West. However, the truth is, most of the famed outlaws were taken down from behind or in a surprise attack. These were outlaws in every sense of the word. To say that life was difficult for Robert Ford and his brother would be an understatement. Rather than becoming heroes, the public scorned and taunted them. Even returning to their hometown was not enough to save them. To add to the tension, a rumor began to go around stating that Jesse James's brother, Frank, was out for revenge. Ford held under the pressure, but his brother Charlie didn't. Ford did not seem overly concerned about the rumor of revenge from Frank James. Charlie, however, did, despite having no real blood on his hands. Charlie began moving from town to town to evade Frank's wrath. During this time, his health was also deteriorating. He had developed a morphine addiction and contracted tuberculosis. In the end, it was too many things to run from. Robert Ford may have been the one who pulled the trigger on Jesse James. However, it seemed that it was his brother who felt the weight of it more. In May 1884, Charles Ford took his own life. It's hard to say his reason. Legends claim the fear of Frank James did him in. However, tuberculosis was going to take his life regardless. Whatever the reason, Robert Ford was now left to make his way alone. Ford may have lost his brother, but he still had the companionship of Liddell. Together with Liddell, Ford relocated to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where the pair opened a saloon. It seemed Robert Ford was starting again. However, his bad luck continued to follow him. he continued to reach for glory and continued to fall flat. Ford got into a revolver contest with a compatriot of Billy the Kid. Ford couldn't keep up. He lost the contest and fled town when talks of a duel started coming around. Misfortune would continue to follow him. In December 1889, he found himself in Kansas City. He was enjoying his time in a gambling house when suddenly, the bartender approached him with dark intent. The bartender of the gambling house, known as Fat, attempted to murder Robert Ford with a knife. Ford survived, but this wouldn't be the last attempt on his life. After several years of wandering from town to town, Ford again attempted to settle down. He first landed in Walsenburg, Colorado, where he opened a saloon and gambling house. However, it wouldn't be long until something else caught his eye. Silver, found in Creede, made that village far more appealing than Walsenburg. Ford was nothing if not determined. Chasing the promise of silver, Ford closed up his Walsenburg establishment and moved to Creede. May 29, 1892, saw the opening of Ford's Exchange, a dance hall. Unfortunately, Ford's fortunes didn't change because he'd moved town. Ford's Exchange was doomed, as was Ford himself. If Ford moved to Creede with dreams of finally finding success, then Creede left him with great disappointments.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
Ford opened his dance hall at the end of May 1892. 6 days later, fire ravaged the businesses of Creede. Everything, including the dance hall, burnt down. Robert Ford didn't let that stop him. He ran a saloon out of a tent. On June 8, 1892, 3 days after the fire and only 10 days after opening the dance hall, Edward O'Kelly entered the tent saloon, and Ford would never leave it. The story goes that Ford had his back turned when O'Kelly entered with his intentions plain. However, unlike Ford, O'Kelly announced his presence, greeting Ford with a "Hello, Bob." As Ford turned around, O'Kelly fired. Ford was hit in the neck and perished immediately. Although those in power charged O'Kelly and he served 9 years of an 18-year sentence, he never gave a reason for his act. Rumors have circled, but no one can confirm their validity. In the end, he was merely the man who killed Jesse James. And Robert Ford, for all his dreams of glory, was laid to rest with the words, "The man who shot Jesse James," on his grave. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want a say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.